Chapter 1. Ishmael's story begins when he is 10 years old, 2 years before the civil war comes to his village. He describes the idea of war as entirely abstract to his young mind and insists that he and his fellow villagers didn't have the capacity to understand what the refugees coming through his village had experienced. It was too terrible and unimaginable. Ishmael, Jr., Taloy, and Mohammed have been singing and dancing to rap music since they formed a group when Ishmael was 8 years old. They learned of rap during a visit to Mabimbai, where their fathers and other foreigners worked for an American company. They were transfixed by the music and returned as often as possible to watch rap on the big television. What shocked Ishmael so much about rap was that black men could speak English so well and so quickly to the beat. The rap music has defined how Ishmael and his group dress and use slang. In January of 1993, Ishmael, Jr., and Taloy set off from their village of Mogbumo on a trip to the town of Matrojong to participate in a friend's talent show. They visit the town of Kabati, Ishmael, and Jr.'s grandmother's village. Along the way, there, Mamie Kapena, as the grandmother is known, questions them about their schooling. When they reach Matrojong, they meet up with their friends, Gibrila, Kaloko, and Kalilu. The boys stay at Kalilu's house and are surprised when he returns home from school early the next day to report that rebels have attacked Mogbumo. Kalilu tells them that the rebels will be coming to Matrojong next. Villagers begin arriving from the mining area in Ishmael's home village, but no one knows anything about the safety of Ishmael and Jr.'s family. The villagers say that the attack was too sudden and that, in the chaos, everyone ran in different directions to save their own lives. Ishmael, Jr., and Taloy decide they must return to their village and find their families. As the boys begin retracing their steps, they encounter remnants of the attack, crowds of people running, women hiding in bushes screaming their children's names, children, naked and lost, following packs of stray dogs. Ishmael describes cars packed with dead people covered in blood and the terror on everyone's faces as he passes. They realize that a journey back to the village is impossible. They return to Matrojong and spend their days waiting at the wharf for word from their families. Ishmael has nightmares of the attack he didn't see but the horrors he imagines. Chapter 2. This chapter begins in Ishmael's nightmare. He dreams of carrying bodies in a wheelbarrow through his village to the cemetery. He describes a scene of horror, mangled bodies, streams of blood, leaking brains, and intestines. His last image is of lifting the cloth off the head of a dead body and seeing that it is his own face. Ishmael wakes from this nightmare to his present life in New York City, where he has been for more than a month. His mind then wanders back to Sierra Leone and his days as a soldier. Ishmael carries an AK-47 on his way to attack a village for their food and ammunition. They open fire on the remaining villagers, many of whom are boys his same age. He and his fellow soldiers congratulate each other with high fives, sit on the dead bodies, and eat the food that the villagers had been carrying. Ishmael is terrified of both his nightmares and his memories and longs only for daylight so he can return to his new life. Chapter 3. Ishmael, Jr., and Taloy remain in Matrojong with their friends, Kaloko, Gibrila, and Kalilu. They still haven't heard from their families and do not know if anyone survived the rebels' attack on their village. A messenger arrives from the town of Sumbuya, the site of the most recent massacre. The rebels have carved the initials RUF, Revolutionary United Front, with a hot bayonet on the messenger's body. The messenger reports that the rebels will be arriving in Matrojong soon and they expect to be welcomed since they claim to fight for the people. Most of the village goes into hiding, but after 10 days without the rebels arriving, life returns to normal. 5 days later, the rebels attack, Ishmael and his friends escape. Chapter 4. Ishmael, his brother, and their friends walk for days in hunger and silence. They pass through abandoned villages and see houses ransacked and dead bodies everywhere. Their hunger becomes all-consuming, and they are forced to return to Kalilu's house for money and provisions. They find the house destroyed, but Ishmael's tiny bag of money is still stashed under the foot of the bed. To seek safety, the group must cross a clearing filled with dead bodies. During the crossing, something falls out of a pocket and makes enough noise to alert the rebel guards in a nearby tower. Ishmael, who has already reached the other side, watches his brother pretend to be dead among the bodies so that the guards don't shoot. Though the boys now have money to buy food, they find that the neighbors in the nearby villages won't sell to them. Either there aren't enough provisions or the villagers are stashing supplies for their own later struggle to survive. Ishmael and his band steal food in the night. Chapter 5. Their hunger drives Ishmael's group to chase down a child they find eating ears of corn. It wasn't an orchestrated attack but rather an instinctual assault. Later, the boy's mother brings Ishmael and his friends more corn, but Ishmael writes that there was no room for remorse in such desperation. Their hunger also forces them to return to Matrojong even though they know it's a dangerous move. On the way, they are captured by the rebels and forced at gunpoint to join a larger group of refugees. The rebels taunt and torture an old man and force Ishmael's group to watch and to laugh. Ishmael is shocked because, before the war, no one of his age would dare disrespect an elder like that. War has negated the social norms. The rebels divide the group, separating Ishmael and Junior, and tell them their initiation will be to kill each other. Then, they march them to a riverbank and force them to their knees. Gunfire breaks out and the rebels hide, which gives Ishmael, Junior, and their friends time to escape again into the woods, where they hide under dead trees until it's safe. On their way to the next village, Junior smiles at Ishmael but it is the only release of emotion among the group. They walk in silence and do not speak about the attack until the next day. Chapter 6. Because Ishmael and his friends travel as a band of young boys, they are often feared by local villagers, so the boys stick to the bushes and try to avoid the towns. Once, they are captured by a group of men who are volunteer guards for their village and are brought before the village council. Because they have no identifying information, the chief threatens to have them drowned. They find a cassette tape of rap music in Ishmael's pocket and play it for the council. The foreignness of the song makes them even more suspicious of the group. They are saved when a young boy from Matrojong remembers their rap group's performance and is able to name Ishmael, Junior, and their friends. Once the chief knows that they aren't rebels, he offers them shelter and food, but the group decides to move on because they know that attacks on all the villages are imminent. During their travels, the boys meet a woman who tells them that Gibral's aunt is in a village called Kamatur, and they decide to seek shelter there. They arrive in time to be part of the planting season and are given the job of clearing the land. They farm with the villagers for 3 months before the rebels arrive and they are forced to abandon the land without ever seeing the fruits of their labor. During the attack, the group is separated, and Ishmael never sees Junior again. Chapter 7. Kamatur, the village Ishmael, Junior, and their friends are hiding in, is attacked late one night without warning. Most of the villagers are at evening prayer when the rebels invade. They capture the imam, tie his body to a post in the town center, and light him on fire. The rest of the villagers are killed or flee into the bush. Ishmael manages to escape, but he is separated from his brother and friends. After a night in hiding, Ishmael finds Kalako and they return to the village to find everything burned. Ishmael and Kalako hide with the family for 2 weeks, but the silence and fear become too much and Ishmael sets out on his own. He walks toward the sea and for 5 days straight he doesn't see any other people. All the villages have been abandoned and burned. Chapter 8. Ishmael keeps walking to survive. He passes through the remains of villages filled with dead bodies and rivers running red with blood. He sees the terror on the victims' faces and it makes him walk faster. He finds himself in a dense patch of forest with large, high trees and feels safe for the first moments in months. He eats unfamiliar fruit and waits to see if it's poisonous. This reminds him of his grandfather's knowledge of herbal medicines from the forest and Ishmael wishes he'd listened more and learned how to survive in nature. His loneliness is overwhelming, but he finds solace in the sounds of nature, which gratefully help to drown out his terrifying memories. He begins fearing sleep and where his thoughts might take him. After encountering an aggressive pack of wild pigs, Ishmael leaves the forest and returns to the path. He runs into a group of boys, and they are all stunned from the meeting. Fortunately, Ishmael recognizes a few of the boys from his school days and joins the group, but after a month in the forest without human contact, he's uncomfortable around people and uncertain how to behave. Ishmael also worries that being with a group of 7 boys will invite trouble. He decides that his loneliness is too much, though, and accepts the risk. He travels with the boys for days and finds that rumors of the group terrify people in the villages as they approach. They are often attacked and struggle to defend themselves. Once the villagers realize that they are only a group of innocent children fleeing the war, they are more sympathetic. Chapter 9. Ishmael's group reaches the ocean and finds a village nearby where they expect to be welcomed because they assume war hasn't reached the coast. When they enter the village, they find it eerily abandoned, as if the rebels had already attacked. Instead, the boys are attacked, bound, and dragged to the chief. Rather than kill them, the villagers steal their shoes and chase them from the village. Ishmael and the boys are forced to walk barefoot in the sand in 120-degree temperatures. At the end of the day, Ishmael's feet are covered with peeling flesh and congealed blood laced with sand. The group collapses in a hut, and the man who lives there tends their injuries and feeds them. The boys must stay and heal their feet before they can move on. On the fourth night, they ask their host his name, but he tells them it's better that they don't know. He continues to care for them with food and water, and salt water soaks for their feet until his mother comes to report that the villagers are on their way to attack. Again, the boys are tied up and taken to the village chief. For the second time, the cassettes of rap music save Ishmael and the boys. When the chief hears the music, he makes Ishmael perform. The chief then realizes that they are only children and lets them leave the village in peace. Chapter 10. Ishmael's journey to survive continues in a state of misery. He worries that each time he faces death, a part of him dies a little. He treasures the few moments of joy that bring relief from his constant sorrow. His thoughts return constantly to his family and his longing to see them and know their fate. Ishmael and the boys travel from village to village, often finding them abandoned. They sleep a night, forage for food, and move on. In one village, they are allowed to take part in a festival and given a bag of dried meat when they leave the next morning. The meat is stolen and eaten by a stray dog, and the boys blame each other. They choose not to harm the dog, but they realize that the day may come when they will be desperate enough to do something completely uncustomary, like eat dog meat for survival. In this chapter, each of the other boys, Musa, Al-Hajj, Kani, Jama, Moraba, and Sedu, share their stories of the rebels attacking their village. The tales are horrific, including accounts of slaughter, torture, and rape, and Ishmael realizes why they so often rely on silence to protect themselves from their past. The boys continue moving, walking at night and hunting for food during the day. They sleep during the day in shifts so that someone is always on guard against attacks. They tell stories to each other, and Ishmael recalls his name-giving ceremony. Along the way, a crow falls from the sky, which they consider a bad omen, but they are hungry enough to eat the bird. Later, Sedu falls ill and can't respond. When he wakes, they help him to a nearby village and are surprised to see how crowded and lively the village is. The marketplace is running, and people are dancing in the streets. Sedu continues to faint, and the boys decide to rest one day in the village so that he can recover. They are fed and given a veranda to sleep on. A woman finds them and tells each of them news of their family. Ishmael learns that Junior has recently been in the village. Ishmael can't sleep because of his excitement. During the night, Sedu dies, and the boys are responsible for honoring his death and burying his body before they begin traveling again, this time in search of their families. Chapter 11. Ishmael and his friends approach the village where they've been told some of their families are living. They meet Gasamu, a banana farmer whom Ishmael knows, and agree to help him carry bananas into the village. As they approach, they hear gunshots, dogs barking, and people screaming. The village is under attack. The boys drop their bananas and hide in the bushes. They watch the horror until the gunshots subside. Then Ishmael runs into the village, which is engulfed in flames, and finds bodies burned beyond recognition everywhere. Gasamu follows him and shows him the hut where Ishmael's family had been. Ishmael rushes in but doesn't find any bodies inside. Ishmael attacks Gasamu in anger and the boys begin fighting among themselves. The approaching voices of rebels cause the boys and Gasamu to hide. They overhear the rebels boasting of the killings, but there is uncertainty as to whether some villagers may have escaped. Gunshots begin again and the boys run deeper into the forest with bullets at their back. When the boys finally stop, they realize that Gasamu has multiple gunshot wounds. They take him to the wali outside the village, where he dies. Chapter 12. After walking for days, the boys are captured by a group of soldiers and taken to Yul, a village occupied by the military. There, they are put to work chopping vegetables, carrying water, and washing dishes. It is a welcomed relief, but Ishmael suffers severe headaches daily. The village seems an oasis of normalcy in the war, but it is flooded with orphans. Ishmael writes that there is nothing to fear during the days in the village. Children play soccer and marbles and parents tend their children. But Ishmael suffers migraines and nightmares and withdraws from village life. Weeks later, the village of Yul is surrounded by rebels, and the military are losing the war. They tell the boys and men that they must either join their forces and fight or leave the village. Ishmael and his friends feel that they have no choice. Leaving the village means an immediate death at the hands of the rebels. The next day, they are moved into tents near the soldiers' barracks and given guns. There are more than 30 boys, from 7-year-olds to 16-year-olds. They are given new shoes and clothing. Ishmael's old clothes are burned with the cassette tapes of his rap music inside. Ishmael is both furious and terrified about joining the fight, but when he seeks solace from his friends, they all turn away in silence. The army of boys begins training. They learn to shoot AK-47s and to kill rebels by using bayonets on banana trees. They are continually reminded that these rebels killed their families and that they are inhumane. The only hope for revenge, they are told, and for justice is to do the same to the rebels that was done to their own parents and loved ones. Chapter 13. The boy soldiers are given the day off from training to play. They form a soccer game and swim and enjoy themselves. When the lieutenant calls them back to service, the boys push and shove each other into the bushes. They are given guns and live ammunition for the first time and marched off to the forest to fight. Each boy is given a white tablet to boost their energy before being sent into the forest to fight, as if drugs are necessary to turn them into men. Ishmael and the other boy soldiers fight alongside the military, and Ishmael kills a man for the first time. Two of his close friends, Musa and Josiah, are shot, and he watches them die. The death of his friends stirs anger in Ishmael that allows him to fight harder. He and the corporal strip the bodies of guns and ammunition, and Ishmael writes that he feels nothing toward the bodies of the rebels. He flips over the dead bodies of the rebels with his foot and notices that they wear necklaces and gold watches, presumably taken from the families in the villages they raided. After the battle, Ishmael is numb. He falls asleep quickly, but as the drug's effect wears off, his nightmares return. He wakes from his dream and begins shooting his gun inside the tent. The corporal and lieutenant rush in, splash water in his face, and give Ishmael more pills. With the help of the drugs, Ishmael goes into 2 more battles and fights. Chapter 14. Like the other soldiers, Ishmael relies on drugs to power him through his duties. He begins smoking marijuana along with taking the white energy pills. He also snorts brown, which is a mixture of cocaine and gunpowder. The drugs cause sleeplessness, so he stays up late into the night watching violent Rambo movies. When the soldiers run out of drugs, food, ammunition, and gasoline, they raid rebel camps. They also attack civilian villages to force more young boys and men to join their army. The army lieutenant justifies their attacks by lecturing that they are fighting for the defense of the country, whereas the rebels kill without cause. When he slits someone's throat and tortures rebels, Ishmael and the men cheer and enjoy the violence. One afternoon, the corporal chooses a few rebel prisoners for a contest. He chooses Ishmael and other young soldiers for a throat-slitting competition. The first to kill in the least amount of time wins. Ishmael quickly and deftly uses his bayonet to slice his prisoner's Adam's apple in a zigzag. He is awarded the title of junior lieutenant and celebrates with the other men with more drugs and more war movies. Chapter 15. Ishmael's reality has shifted so much that his squad is now his only family and the forest and villages they capture are his home. His only thought is to kill or be killed. His gun both provides for and protects him. His thoughts and actions have become so simple that days blend into one another, and he maintains no concept of time. In January of 1996, when Ishmael is 15 years old, his world is again changed. UNICEF men arrive to take the boy soldiers from the war zone. Ishmael and his friends are lined up, and the lieutenant chooses the youngest ones to be released from their duty. He tells them that the UNICEF men will put them in schools and find them new lives. The lieutenant says that they've served their brotherhood and their country well, but he doesn't give them any other explanation for their dismissal. The boys are taken to a fenced compound in Freetown, Sierra Leone's capital. They are given food and beds with clean linens. They look at the beds as if they don't know what they are and they consume the food in seconds. Other groups of boy soldiers are there, and they begin fighting them until they realize that they, too, are from the army. Later, a group of boy soldiers from the RUF are brought in and a war between the groups breaks out. The MPs and nationals try to break up the fight, but Mombu overtakes them and steals a gun. He begins shooting rebels. 6 people are killed before more MPs arrive and break up the battle by force. Ishmael and the remaining boy soldiers are taken to Benin Home, a rehabilitation center, but they still can't understand why. Ishmael's headaches return as his body begins withdrawing from drugs. Chapter 16. Ishmael and the other boy soldiers in the rehabilitation center behave like caged animals. They attack the cook, throw bowls and silverware at the nurses and counselors, break into the medical supplies for drugs, and drag their mattresses out into courtyard in the rain so that they can sleep outside where they are more comfortable. For entertainment, they attack local villagers at the water pump and fight each other bloody in the boredom of the afternoons. One afternoon the boys decide to break windows and Ishmael uses his bare hands. He cuts himself and bleeds uncontrollably. He goes to the hospital thinking he'll steal a first aid kit and treat himself, but a kind nurse convinces him to let her clean and bandage his wounds. He becomes more ill from the drug withdrawal in the hospital and stays in bed for days being cared for by the nurse. Time and the staff's kindness and forgiveness wear the boys down. They begin to realize the extent of their trauma as their war memories begin unfolding. Ishmael writes that he has to fight through the war memories to remember anything from his childhood. After each violent outburst, the boys are told it isn't their fault. When they destroy their things, they are replaced without incident. Ishmael, Momview, and Al-Hajj sell their school supplies and use the money to ride the bus into the city. The staff begins planning weekend trips into the city to discourage the boys from stealing, but they require the boys to attend school for a few hours each afternoon in order to earn the city trips. Ishmael and the others relent to the schooling, but they find it frustrating because of how little they know. Each time they become angry, they are met with patience and kindness and reminded that their lack of schooling isn't their fault either. While in the rehabilitation hospital, Ishmael recalls a particularly bloody battle in which he and his friend Altai slaughtered an entire village by themselves. For their success, they were given nicknames. Ishmael's name was Green Snake because of his ability to hide beneath bushes in an advantageous position and be sneaky. He's pleased with the nickname, but his approval shows just how distorted his sense of morality has become. A snake symbolizes something evil and dangerous, like the snake in the Garden of Eden that tempted Adam and Eve to sin. Ishmael considers his treachery a compliment and strives to live up to all that being a snake implies. Chapter 17. Ishmael's first breakthrough in rehabilitation comes because his nurse, Esther, buys him a Walkman and rap cassettes. At first, it makes him angry, but then the music overtakes him and he begins opening up to Esther about his past. He tells her of a battle in which he was shot in the foot 3 times and a doctor performed a surgery to remove the bullet without anesthesia. Ishmael fainted from the pain and was given cocaine. His lieutenant told him he would now be killing the men who had shot his foot and caused him so much pain. When Ishmael recounts the story to Esther, she cries in sympathy and tries to comfort him by telling him again that his soldiering is not his fault. This angers Ishmael and he throws the Walkman at her. Esther continues to use music to lure Ishmael into therapy. He exchanges his memories for hours listening to Bob Marley cassettes. She also gives him a notebook and encourages him to begin writing lyrics again. Ishmael begins to look forward to their sessions, but he is still plagued by migraines whenever he tries to recall his childhood. Chapter 18. Observers from the UN, UNICEF, and several non-governmental organizations, NGOs, arrive to see the rehabilitation center, and the boys put on a talent show. Ishmael recites a monologue from Shakespeare and performs rap and dance. The center's directors are so impressed that they ask if he'll become a spokesperson for the center. Ishmael decides that rehabilitation is possible and declares that children are strong enough to overcome what's happened to them in times of war, if they are given an opportunity to do so. Leslie, Ishmael's caseworker, finds Ishmael's uncle Tommy, whom he's never met. Tommy visits Ishmael at the center and calls him his son now. He embraces him and promises him a place to live and welcomes him to his family. Ishmael is hesitant at first, but Tommy's sincerity and emotions win him over. Tommy begins visiting on the weekends and, during their walks, Ishmael tells him about good times before the war. Finally, Tommy takes him to visit his new family, and Ishmael begins learning even more about his father and his past. Chapter 19. Ishmael says goodbye to his friends in Benin home and moves in with Uncle Tommy's family. His adjustment to family life is challenging, as he's not used to stability and happiness. He relies on silence and withdraws as much as possible. Ali, the oldest cousin, sneaks Ishmael out to go dancing one night. Ishmael meets a girl and they date for a few weeks until she pushes him to know more about his past. Ishmael has other relationships with girls that end the same way, but he seems content to be alone. Leslie visits and encourages Ishmael to apply to be part of a delegation of children who will visit the United Nations in New York and tell their stories. Ishmael shows up for the interview underdressed and unprepared, but his story is compelling enough to earn him a place. He is invited to visit the United States and guided with special accommodations through the passport and visa process. Chapter 20. Ishmael finds New York City brutally cold and amazing. He spends hours walking the streets and watching people. He's shocked by how different the city is than what he had perceived it to be from rap music. At the United Nations conference, he meets other delegates and learns their stories. He realizes that wars and conflict have stolen other childhoods like his. He and the other delegates have long discussions about how to end the suffering in war-torn countries. Ishmael bonds with a storyteller, Laura Sims, who invites the children to share their struggles through oral tradition and music. Chapter 21. Ishmael returns to his uncle's home in Freetown and begins the school year. The students know that he was a boy soldier and fear that he'll snap at any moment and hurt them, so they sit apart and refuse to speak to Ishmael and Mohammed. Ishmael begins calling Mohammed his brother so that neither of them have to explain their past. On May 25, 1997, violence breaks out in the capital. Ishmael wakes to gunfire and fears the return of civil war. He writes that he doubts he could live through the violence again. By nightfall, the civilian government has been overthrown by a coup collaboration involving the RUF and the military, also called the Sobels. They begin blowing up bank vaults for money and raiding markets and homes for supplies. People are killed by stray bullets. The schools and universities are occupied, so Ishmael and his cousins remain inside their home. One afternoon, Ishmael and Mohammed risk going into town to buy food and are swept up in a mob protest. Gunmen open fire on the crowded market and many civilians are killed. Ishmael and Mohammed hide in a nearby ditch until nightfall. For the next 5 months gunmen rule the streets, looting, raping, and killing people. Ishmael has escaped the war only to have the war find him. Uncle Tommy falls ill one night, and there are no pharmacies or hospitals open to take him to. He declines quickly and dies in Ishmael's arms. Ishmael realizes he must escape the war and the chaos or he'll be pulled back into soldiering again. He calls Laura and asks if he can come to New York and live with her. She agrees to help. Ishmael escapes the country illegally and makes a harrowing journey to the Sierra Leone embassy in Guinea, where he is given shelter as a war refugee.